All right. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. And we welcome you to the Great Lakes Freshwater Symposium. Today's topic is Great Lakes Offshore Wind with Cora Sutherland. This event is a part of a quarterly water symposium series sponsored by the Freshwater Collaborative of Wisconsin, the Great Lakes Higher Education Consortium, and the Council of the Great Lakes Region. These events seek to encourage and advance collaborations, share science across borders, encourage students in research and career opportunities, and present research that is solving real-world problems. We start today's event with a land and water acknowledgement. As a system of universities in Wisconsin, we share stewardship of the land and water between the Michigami, the full system of Great Lakes, and Michizzibi, the Great Mississippi River, with the current sovereign nations of Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Ojibwe, Oneida, and Mohican people, along with the ancestors before them. Together, we commit to being connected to this space, increasing our knowledge of it, and transmitting that knowledge to future generations. And our thanks to the Electric Quinney Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee for crafting this land and water acknowledgement for the Freshwater Collaborative. So the Great Lakes contain 20% of the planet's fresh water. They also hold tremendous potential for producing wind energy. So when we think about all of that, we think, what are the challenges and opportunities for offshore wind energy in the Great Lakes? So Cora Sutherland is here today to present the Center for Water Policy's legal research on Great Lakes offshore wind energy. Her talk, titled Great Lakes Offshore Wind, or GLOW for short, Legal Design Choices and Research Questions, will distinguish the Great Lakes region from ocean waters in the United States. It will explore legal design and planning choices and summarize a recent National Science Foundation funded research workshop on GLOW. Cora Sutherland is the intern assistant director of the Center for Water Policy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She holds a Juris Doctorate from the University of Oregon School of Law, where she earned top honors and graduated as a member of the Order of the Coif. Her legal and policy experience centers on renewable energy and its many implications for the environment and society. At the Center for Water Policy, Cora identifies issues and analyzes solutions to shape Great Lakes and Mississippi River Basin water policy. Two areas of focus are the emerging regulatory landscape for Great Lakes offshore wind energy and Great Lakes coastal resilience. Thanks so much for leading us down this discussion. Cora, please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my slides first here. Marissa, can you let me know that you can see this PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. Okay, thanks so much. Okay, great. Well, yeah, I'm Cora Sutherland. Thank you all for being here. I'm the interim assistant director at the Center for Water Policy. I'm sitting in the Milwaukee Harbor District right now at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's School of Freshwater Sciences. And I'm going to be talking about Great Lakes Offshore Wind, or GLOW for short. It's a really nice, convenient acronym that we have. I'll talk about legal frameworks and planning tools and a recent NSF workshop on this topic. So an overview of what I'll talk about. I'm going to highlight why it is that we're researching Great Lakes offshore wind. There's not any wind turbines in the Great Lakes at this time. So why is this something that we're looking at? Another part of the story of why we're doing this research relates to a School for Freshwater Sciences water consulting course, which led to our participation in a call for proposals for a U.S. National Science Foundation workshop that we held this past year. I'll dive into our legal research at the Center for Water Policy in two main pieces here: legal framework for net positive social, environmental, and financial benefits, and then also touch on some coastal management planning tools and the role of clean energy goals for offshore wind. And I'll wrap up with some next steps, many of the open research questions we have, and then some takeaways from our NSF workshop that I think apply broader than just that workshop. So first, I want to acknowledge the scope of our research and note that although the Great Lakes are a shared resource, we've really honed in on the US context, the US federal government and federal leasing, as well as the 8 Great Lakes states in the US that border the lakes. And so I want to do a quick, just sort of set the foundation of the landscape in Canada before turning into our research. Around 2010 in Canada, there were a couple proposed and licensed projects in the Great Lakes. These names may maybe ring a bell, maybe not. And then in 2011, the Ontario government imposed a moratorium on any offshore wind development in the Great Lakes. Several years later, 2017, the Ontario government continued that moratorium, like no indication that they were going to be removing it. And my understanding is that that moratorium is still in place today. And as I was doing this brief research to update on the landscape in Canada, it looks like there's a prominent advocacy group trying to remove that moratorium. And I won't speak to that one way or the other, but just sort of acknowledging where things are at this time. I also want to acknowledge that just a few months ago, in October of this year, the Canadian national government passed legislation to pursue offshore wind as a resource, though that's located on the Atlantic seaboard. And it's actually quite similar to the landscape in the US, which is that there are no offshore wind projects in the Great Lakes, but there is momentum with the national government on the ocean coasts. And I'll talk more about that. So why is it that we're looking at Great Lakes offshore wind? Climate disruption is growing, and international agreement that the world needs to produce energy from renewable sources is also growing. And the big question is, how do we decarbonize our systems deeply and quickly? And that's a big challenge that we're all grappling with today. In 2023, the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, published their Great Lakes Wind Energy Challenges and Opportunities Assessment. In this report, they identified the large wind resource of the lakes and even asserted that 5 of the 8 US Great Lakes states could meet their annual statewide electricity demands and more, and actually provide renewable power beyond their borders just from offshore wind in the Great Lakes. Now that's a really big assertion, and it is theoretical. And so that doesn't necessarily take into account, other uses of the lakes, Great Lakes, or I'm sorry, navigation channels, migration pathways, other uses of the lakes, but it does underline this theme that the Great Lakes offer a large resource that is currently untapped. And in reality, along with technology and navigation and migration and other factors that we need to consider if this opportunity is pursued, we also argue that the resource will only be tapped if there's a legal framework in order to do so in a timely manner and in a responsible manner. And again, there are currently no offshore wind turbines on the Great Lakes, and the movement has been on the oceans. The US has an energy goal from the Biden-Harris administration to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by the year 2030, which is quite a large and aggressive undertaking. State governments also have decarbonization goals, even though they're not specific to offshore wind. So the 8 Great Lakes states in the US all have some kind of clean or renewable or alternative energy goal in their state. All 8 states have that. 5 of the states have a 100% clean energy goal by either 2040 or 2050, so a more aggressive commitment to 100% renewable energy. In spring 2023, Director of the Center for Water Policy, Melissa Scanlon, taught a graduate course at the School of Freshwater Sciences, where graduate students worked on an multidisciplinary team for a public sector client. And in this semester, the public sector client was the city of Milwaukee, and the project was related to the feasibility and impact of Lake Michigan offshore wind. The students in their report evaluated offshore wind off the coast of Milwaukee and provided recommendations for optimal placement and stakeholder engagement related to any sort of offshore wind project. The School of Freshwater Sciences promoted this story at that time in May of 2023, and a potential collaborator from UW-Madison saw this project in the news and then reached out to the Center for Water Policy and Director Scanlon when he started to assemble a team to respond to a call for proposals from the National Science Foundation. Here is an excerpt from the call for proposals from the NSF. This was a Dear Colleague letter related to conference proposals on clean energy topics. The goal of the workshops was to initiate new collaborations in clean energy topics and increase the use of clean energy sources to benefit all sectors of the economy, ensure social justice, and contribute to the public good. And so this is the call for proposals that we answered as a group and received funding to host a workshop in response to this. This slide shows all the different pieces of our grant workshop group. So you can see this ring of hexagons in the sort of top right. There are 2 yellow hexagons. That's Melissa and myself working on legal and regulatory aspects. But just take a moment and look at some of these other aspects of the team that hosted this workshop. We have marine wildlife and migrations, fisheries and water recreation, electrical systems, stakeholder and community ownership, tribal alliances, and energy justice, all different disciplines that are related to any potential Great Lakes offshore wind industry. We came together and hosted this workshop. And on the right is the logo that we came up with for the workshop. You can also see the various institutions represented in this group. So Melissa and I being at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, our other collaborator at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, folks from the University of Minnesota, another Great Lakes state, Michigan Tech, Michigan's another Great Lakes state, and then some national laboratories, NREL, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, among others. The workshop was actually a 2-part sort of invited workshop. Part 1 was a virtual subtopic panel hosted in August of 2024. And going back to this slide, the yellow hexagons here, Melissa and I, we hosted a subtopic panel in August on legal and regulatory topics. And then all these other topics hosted their subtopics panel discussion in the summer as part 1 of this workshop series. And here is a list of our panelists at the workshop. We had a combination of practitioners and academic researchers talking about legal and regulatory aspects of potential Great Lakes offshore wind. And what was really a highlight of this part 1 workshop is that we incorporated discussion throughout the session and heard really great questions and input from the invited participants instead of having sort of a one-way communication from the panel. It was fantastic to get input from folks that we could then bring together as part of the in-person workshop the following month with all of those other disciplines all together. At the part 2 in-person workshop in Madison, Wisconsin, we all came together as various subtopics, and we met in cross-disciplinary groups to try to break out of these discipline silos that sometimes we as researchers can get stuck in. We wanted to get a better understanding of other disciplines' research methods and questions and needs, and sort of have that exchange across disciplines to understand how we could better support each other and better identify questions and then eventually facilitate the research to identify answers. I'm going to turn to our research here at the Center for Water Policy. We have 2 Great Lakes offshore wind law review articles this year, and I'm going to talk about our research kind of in those 2 buckets that match our articles. The first here on the left is related to legal frameworks for net positive social, environmental, and financial benefits. And then the second will be about coastal management plans and clean energy goals related to offshore wind. And I just want to emphasize my collaborators on this research. So Andrian Lee is a former water policy specialist, postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Water Policy. And again, Melissa Scanlon, she's our director and a professor at the School of Freshwater Sciences. So part 1 related to legal frameworks. I'll talk about the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. That's the federal agency in charge of federal leases for offshore wind projects. I'll talk about non-price criteria, which are any terms other than price, such as environmental benefits, that can be used to assess a project or select a project among competitors. The Netherlands and Maryland offer examples related to non-price criteria. Then I'll move to public trust models for lakebed lease revenue, looking at Pennsylvania, Alaska, and Ohio as examples for different models. And I'll talk more about what public trust generated revenue is. An important distinction to make between the Great Lakes and ocean offshore wind development relates to submerged lands jurisdiction. So for ocean states, states on the ocean coast, those states have jurisdiction over the submerged lands, so like the seabed, for 3 miles from their coastline out into the ocean. After that 3-mile belt, jurisdiction is federal. So that's federal jurisdiction. In contrast, Great Lakes states have jurisdiction over the entire lake bed from their coastline out until they reach the political boundary of either another neighboring state's jurisdiction or the international boundary with Canada. And that's a big difference from the 3-mile state jurisdiction belt on the oceans. I have a blue arrow here on this map pointing to the southern part of Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is up to 118 miles wide. So if you think about half of that, that's a lot more area that we're talking about compared to that 3-mile belt for states that border the ocean. And this is an important distinction because it implicates different leasing authority for potential offshore wind projects. The ocean bed beyond the 3 miles is leased by the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, and most offshore wind projects in the ocean are farther than 3 miles from the coast. And so most projects in the ocean are leased by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM. In contrast, there is no federal leasing authority in the Great Lakes lakebed because all of the lakebed is the jurisdiction of the adjacent state to that lakebed. And so that's a big difference. That's one overarching federal entity for most offshore wind projects in the oceans compared to potentially 8, and that's, again, we're only talking about the US part of things, 8 different states that may have a different leasing authority for shared lakes. And so that can complicate things and is important to identify. This slide is an example of the renewable energy process in the federal process. And what I want to highlight here is all of the different steps and approvals and permitting that are conducted by BOEM, right? That single federal agency for projects in the oceans that would need to potentially be conducted by each Great Lakes state or a regional body for any projects in the Great Lakes. And you can see there are some slightly fuzzy numbers here associated with the steps of this process. And those are years. So this is a multi-year, of course, process, and that's a lot of moving parts for a state agency or a regional body to conduct. We focused our research on leasing and auctions for offshore wind. Federal leases leased by BOEM are primarily selected with price-based criteria. So that's like the highest bidder concept for these leases. And I want to draw your attention to this table, the right-hand column of this table, the bonus column. We compiled all the federal offshore wind leases through August of 2023, and this table is an excerpt of that compilation. And in the right-hand bonus column, you can see these leases have massive amounts of money in bonuses associated with obtaining these leases. So in the Atlantic Ocean, this top half, some project off the coast of New York, these bonuses are hundreds of millions of dollars and even over $1 billion for a bonus associated with obtaining these leases. The bottom part of this table highlights a few examples off the coast of California, the west coast of the United States, and those are also hundreds of millions of dollars in bonus payments for these leases. And these are acquiring submerged land leases that for an area that will rely on floating turbine technology, as opposed to the fixed technology, which we can see on land and which is used in the Atlantic. Floating wind turbine technology is not ready to be deployed at scale at this time, and yet these developers are committing hundreds of millions of dollar bonuses to acquire these leases and develop that eventually. And so these large bonuses raise questions about the value of the Great Lakes lake bed for similar energy development in the Great Lakes region. And I'm going to talk more about that. I do want to acknowledge BOEM's final renewable energy modernization rule from May 2024, May of this year. That rule allows for the consideration of non-price criteria or non-monetary factors. Most lease sales, though, will have a cap on bidding credits up to 0.25% of the highest bid. So 1/4 of a bid could be non-price criteria. And again, it's permitted, but it's not required. Just want to highlight that. Moving to models of trust-generated revenues. So when I say trust generated, when I'm referring to the trust, I'm talking about the public trust doctrine. And the lake bed of the Great Lakes is held in trust by each respective state that has jurisdiction over that portion for the beneficiaries of the public trust. That's us, that's the people of the state. States as trustees have duties to manage trust resources responsibly for beneficiaries, for us, for the people. We looked at 3 different models for how states handle revenues generated from those public trust resources. Pennsylvania has an environmental rights amendment to its constitution. Proceeds generated from trust resources must be reinvested back into trust resources. That's Pennsylvania's model. In addition, the trustee has a duty to maximize revenues consistent with industry practice. So if you think back to those large bonuses, typical in the offshore wind industry in the US, what might that mean for Great Lakes states and bonuses and revenue in the Great Lakes? Alaska has a constitutional permanent fund, which requires a percentage of proceeds generated from trust resources be invested and distributed to individual residents of the state, to the various beneficiaries of the trust as an annual permanent fund dividend. So you can see the difference in these 2 models. Pennsylvania requiring proceeds to be reinvested back into trust resources, Alaska distributing revenues to beneficiaries of the trust, to people of the state, and the different sort of approaches there. And I want to highlight for Pennsylvania and Alaska, where we looked at fossil fuel extraction and production as a good sort of proxy because offshore wind is not being developed in Pennsylvania, and of course Alaska is not a Great Lakes state, but that's another piece of the public trust, and so it offers a good analogy for potential wind development. Finally, we looked at Ohio, and I'm going to talk more about the proposed Icebreaker Wind project that does not currently operate in Ohio, but had been leased and permitted over the past decade. So this is a little more specific to offshore wind in the Great Lakes and like submerged lands in the Great Lakes. Rents for a lease in the submerged lands of the Great Lakes for Ohio must be paid into the Lake Erie Submerged Lands Fund. Half of that will go to local government at the project site, and then the other half goes to the Ohio DNR, which is essentially the coastal management program and their assistance program, which provides grants for coastal management efforts. And so it's important to understand the requirements from each state's public trust doctrine. It varies among states, and also consider this an important design choice with various models, different options for how a state might choose to or be required to invest or spend or distribute revenues generated from the public lake bed. Talking about non-price criteria, again, we looked at 2 examples, the Netherlands and Maryland in the US. Non-price criteria is criteria evaluated in a bid in addition to the financial terms, then unrelated to the price. It's separate from like the highest bidder concept. The Netherlands permits up to 50% of the total bid of a developer bidding to get the permits and leases required to develop an offshore wind project. Up to 50% of their bid can be associated with non-price criteria. Also in the Netherlands, independent experts develop non-price criteria, which is an important piece that we want to highlight, as opposed to a developer sort of coming up with it on their own. Not that that couldn't be valuable, but the value of an independent expert sort of developing that non-price criteria is important. An example from the Netherlands a bid in the Netherlands was how the project would contribute to the ecology of the North Sea. That's where the project was located. And so you can see that moving towards choosing projects and soliciting and choosing projects that actually provide positive environmental benefits and social and financial benefits too. In the United States, we looked at Maryland. Maryland has a net environmental benefits analysis, and in effect, that benefit requirement is related to greenhouse gas reduction that is inherent in all offshore wind projects. And so it doesn't quite offer distinction between offshore wind projects when we're choosing between offshore wind projects, because all offshore wind projects have that benefit of creating electricity that doesn't emit greenhouse gases. And so perhaps room for improvement there, but leading in the United States. Other examples in the United States include workforce development, right? Positive social benefits when choosing a project. An important question is whether these criteria can be made robust enough to lead to selecting projects that are truly net positive for the environment and society, as I've been mentioning. And one of the reasons we want to shape and make these legal design choices for benefits is the current status quo is typically, minimize, mitigate, avoid environmental harms. And we have this opportunity where these Great Lakes states do not have set regulations for offshore wind development. If they're going to pursue this industry, it's a fantastic opportunity to also institute beyond the avoid harm approach and actually include environmental and social benefits when selecting projects. The governing body for offshore wind projects could take the form in the Great Lakes, could take the form of a regional body, each state individually, or perhaps a combination. There are various legal design choices about what level of government will regulate GLOW, and a spectrum of regulatory authority for any sort of regional efforts. There are various considerations when thinking about the governing body for offshore wind, or I should say bodies for Great Lakes Offshore Wind. There are startup costs and delays to creating a new group. There are also the politics of Great Lakes states, right? If there's a regional authority, could one state that wants to make progress be hindered by another state that wishes to hinder progress? At the same time, things may be more efficient if regulated by resource, like by lake or by region, right? So there are a lot of sort of open questions and trying to understand those questions more than identifying the answers at this point. However, we do have existing legal tools to do some evaluation of offshore wind. So it's not that we necessarily have to start from scratch. There are things that we can apply to Great Lakes Offshore Wind. Part 2 of our research at the Center for Water Policy related to GLOW relates to coastal management planning. So I'm going to talk about the Coastal Zone Management Act, a federal law in the United States. I'm going to draw distinctions between 2 state-level case studies, an offshore wind project proposed in Lake Erie off the coast of Ohio, and a project in the Atlantic that is operating off the coast of Rhode Island, highlighting the role of regulatory clarity and legal framework in these 2 different stories, as well as the role of clean and renewable energy goals. I'm going to talk a bit about regional collaboratives once again in this coastal management framework, and then end with highlighting our open research questions, both from our research, a bit from the NSF workshop, and end with takeaways from the workshop as well. So the Coastal Zone Management Act is a federal law in the United States. It was passed in the 1970s, and it established the National Coastal Zone Management Program, which is a voluntary program that allows all coastal states, which includes Great Lakes coast, not just ocean coasts, to create a coastal management program that then the federal agency NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, will approve. Once approved, a state's coastal management program impacts any sort of actions that the federal government might take in that coastal zone. And states define their own coastal zone. They have their own definition for a coastal zone. So once approved, federal actions that impact a state's coastal zone or occur in the state's coastal zone must be consistent with that state's coastal program enforceable policies to the maximum extent practicable. So this puts a lot of power in states, in the coastal states programs that they wouldn't have otherwise had over federal activities. And it's important to note that federal actions doesn't just mean physical actions like putting a shovel in the ground. It also includes permitting and funding. So although states have jurisdiction over the lake bed for leasing the lake for offshore wind development, there are still federal permits that would need to take place in order for an offshore wind project to be developed in the Great Lakes. And so this is important to understand this federal consistency concept related to Great Lakes offshore wind development. I also want to highlight the Coastal Zone Enhancement Program of the CZMA. The Coastal Zone Enhancement Program supports and encourages coastal states to improve their coastal management programs every 5 years. And every state, I think except for Alaska at this time, participates in the Coastal Zone Management Program on some level and has a program. Another tool that I want to identify is a special area management plan. I'm going to refer to it as a SAMP. And a SAMP is a comprehensive plan with detailed criteria and mechanisms for implementing natural resource protection in specific geographies within the coastal zone. So this SAMP tool is a way for states to focus in on a particular area or topic of their coastal zone in addition to their larger sort of overarching coastal program. And I'm going to talk more about an example of a SAMP. Also, I want to note that all eight Great Lakes states participate and have a coastal management program, right? Because they're part of all the states other than Alaska. However, none of those 8 states have created a SAMP for Great Lakes offshore wind, and Rhode Island has created an ocean SAMP related to offshore wind development. And so I'm going to talk about that in this comparison. We compared the proposed icebreaker project up the coast of Ohio and Rhode Island's Block Island Wind Farm. Block Island is a really fitting case study for the Great Lakes region because uniquely it's located in state waters, state jurisdiction, even though it's on the ocean, and most projects on the ocean are in federal waters. I'll talk more about how that is. In addition, both of these projects started around the same time, around 2009. Yet they tell 2 very different stories. And so we wanted to understand the difference between these 2 stories. What were the different factors in these 2 cases that led to such different outcomes? Again, the icebreaker project was proposed in Lake Erie, 8 miles off the coast of Cleveland, Ohio. It was indefinitely paused a year ago, December of 2023, so there is not currently wind turbines associated with this project operating or constructed in Lake Erie. When planning for this project, Ohio DNR and Coastal Management created suitability maps to identify sites in Lake Erie and in Ohio's jurisdiction of Lake Erie where the project may be a good fit, right? They considered, this part of the lake is a navigation channel, so overlaid with this part of the lake, which is, important to species migration, like that wouldn't be a suitable site. However, Ohio did not create a comprehensive plan trying to identify best siting for an offshore wind project in their jurisdiction of the lake. Another important piece of this story for the icebreaker project was that the developer faced many legal challenges to environmental review processes, and this is, of course, very lengthy and expensive to go through the courts when processes are challenged. And even though the developer won the challenges, so to speak, it delayed the development of the project quite a bit and was cited as part of the reason this project is indefinitely paused 1 year ago, last December. Finally, I want to identify that the energy goals of Ohio were inconsistent throughout the lifespan of this potential project. Initially, the state of Ohio had a renewable energy goal, and then a few years later that was rolled back, and then this sort of inconsistent flip-flopping of the energy priorities of the state is important to note as a part of this story. So contrasting this with Rhode Island's Block Island project. Again, this Block Island project is in the Atlantic Ocean, but it's actually in Rhode Island state waters. And the state of Rhode Island is not actually an island. So this project is a few miles off of the mainland, next to an actual island called Block Island, which is part of that state. And so that 3-mile jurisdiction belt that I talked about for ocean states, that also applies to that Block Island off of the mainland. And so this offshore wind project is located within 3 miles of that island, even though it's more miles from the mainland, the main piece of the continent. And again, that makes it a great analogy for the Great Lakes region, because any project in the Great Lakes region would be state jurisdiction, at least speaking for the United States. This project became operational in December of 2016. So again, a very different story than the proposed icebreaker project in Ohio. Rhode Island did create an ocean special area management plan, the SAMP coastal management tool that I identified related to coastal management. And again, just as a refresher, SAMP is a comprehensive plan with detailed criteria and mechanisms for implementing natural resource protection in specific areas of the coastal zone. So this ocean SAMP wasn't exclusive to offshore wind, but offshore wind suitability was an important component of this ocean SAMP, and ultimately helped the project be sited and choose a location for it. The Block Island project did face legal challenges, but they were not heavily based on environmental conflicts, in contrast with the icebreaker project. And those legal challenges were resolved quicker. They were not drawn out to the same extent as the icebreaker project. Finally, I want to identify that the energy goals in Rhode Island over the lifetime of this project were consistent and aggressive, and increasing from before the project started through the life of the project until now. So that's another important difference. Ultimately, the reason that we want to understand this is so that we know important factors for any states that pursue this resource. Important takeaways from this case comparison, which I've sort of mentioned, but just to really hit them home. The Block Island wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island was completed, and the icebreaker project was not. It's indefinitely delayed. Regulatory clarity and legal frameworks may play an important role in project completion, and clean and renewable energy goals may also play an important role in project completion. On that note, I want to talk a bit more about clean and renewable energy goals. Calling back to other case studies that we've included in our research. So I talked about the Netherlands. The Netherlands has a zero carbon goal by 2050, and that's not specific to offshore wind, but they have a specific offshore wind carve-out, which is to deploy 21 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by the year 2032. Similarly, the state of Maryland in the US called in 2019 for 1.2 gigawatts of offshore wind, and by the end of 2023, the approved projects pipeline associated with Maryland surpassed that goal. And so this highlights the potential value and importance of offshore wind specific goals for states that are choosing to pursue this resource. In the Great Lakes region, again, I mentioned that all 8 of the states have some kind of clean or renewable or alternative energy goal, and it varies what that looks like across the states. But 5 of the states have a 100% clean or renewable energy goal by the year 2040 or 2050. And again, the takeaway here is that while clean and renewable energy goals are great and can be effective and important, the Ohio story and the Rhode Island story and looking at the Netherlands and Maryland as leaders suggests that offshore wind specific goals are another potentially important tool for states interested in developing GLOW in a timely and responsible manner. And it's not that states in the Great Lakes region don't have experience with such carve-out. Minnesota is an example of a state that was a leader in solar energy carve-outs, and that was a big driver of the solar industry in Minnesota. And so states have experience with this in the region, even though it hasn't been applied to offshore wind specifically. Returning to regional collaboratives, now in the framework of coastal zone management and coastal planning. When I first talked about regional governments, I sort of highlighted that there's a spectrum of what a regional planning body might be, right? It might be a planning body, a collaboration. It might be a body that has more authority and actually regulates or provides leases or something of that nature. And so there's a lot of choices here, but I wanted to highlight a couple things. One being regional ocean partnerships. This is an existing program, and there are several region ocean partnerships along the coasts of the US, the ocean coasts. In 2022, a funding law that provided funds to these existing regional ocean partnerships left open a space for a potential regional Great Lakes partnership and acknowledged that perhaps the Great Lakes may form such partnership. And so that's a potential example. These existing groups exchange information and coordinate data collection and data sharing and things of that nature. There's an example here, this photo of the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative for Offshore Wind. These ocean partnerships are not specific only to offshore wind. They have lots of different topics that they cover, but this is an example of an offshore wind specific effort from one of these groups. And a Great Lakes ocean partnership, or not ocean partnership, a Great Lakes partnership like these ocean partnerships may be creating something new. But in contrast, as I'm sure all of you are well aware, there are existing groups that are already doing important work across the region and may choose to pick up this topic. An example I want to highlight is the Great Lakes Commission. The Great Lakes Commission previously did research on this topic, but it's over 10 years now since they researched this topic of Great Lakes offshore wind, and it's not currently identified as one of their priorities, but I wanted to highlight it as an example of a group that has done and could potentially choose to do this work in the future again. So ending with, well, almost ending with research questions, right? Something I mentioned earlier is that we've identified more questions than answers. And of course, that's an important step in an emerging industry like this. And this is a really, really text-heavy slide, but I do want to go through some of these important questions that we've identified. One of which is, what does the public trust doctrine require? What auction criteria are most consistent with the public trust, right? I talked about different financial criteria, but also non-price criteria, environmental and social benefits. Do Great Lakes states' public trust obligations mandate that they seek the highest possible revenues for leasing the trust lakebed? Think back to those massive bonuses in exchange for leasing the seafloor in federal jurisdiction. Do Great Lakes states have a mandate to seek high revenues for leasing the lakebed because they hold it in trust for all of us? Do Great Lakes states have an obligation to spend trust-generated revenues in a way that benefits public trust rates? I highlighted those three different models: Pennsylvania, Alaska, and Ohio. How must Great Lakes states spend trust-generated revenue? I talked about regional governance models. Is a regional governance model better than an individual state model? There are a lot of pros and cons. That's kind of a loaded question. Is it better? Startup costs, delays, efficiencies, clarity, politics between Great Lakes states. These are all important considerations to think about, especially when we're thinking on a pretty urgent time scale for deploying carbon-free electricity. And again, what does a region look like? Does it make sense to consider the region, the US and Canada and tribal governments all together for the whole region? What about organizing by lake, right? Maybe folks that are focusing on Lake Superior don't need to be involved in folks focusing on Lake Erie. At the same time, we know that the lakes are connected. So these are important questions to be thinking about. How might states leverage Coastal Zone Management Act, or CZMA, consistency review? I talked about federal consistency review. How might they leverage that to facilitate or impede Great Lakes offshore wind development by their neighboring states? I showed a map highlighting the southern part of Lake Michigan, and 4 different states border quite close to each other that lake in the southern part of Lake Michigan: Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. And so if states have different priorities and different interest levels in Great Lakes offshore wind development, how might their coastal management program be used to hinder some of those federal components that are required for projects, even though the state is who's leasing the lake bed. Finally, what are the various benefits and burdens to Great Lakes states recreating something like Rhode Island's ocean stamp for in-depth planning, comprehensive planning? Comprehensive planning can have a lot of benefits, great understanding of all the different factors, but at the same time, that's pretty resource heavy to put all that time and energy into in-depth planning. So assessing the benefits and burdens there. Okay, now ending on conference takeaways. And like I said, I'm tying this back to the takeaways from our workshop, but I think it actually is quite applicable beyond the workshop and frames things nicely moving forward. One important takeaway is there are challenges to offshore wind in the Great Lakes. An example is the need for floating wind turbines instead of fixed turbines like we see on land. A lot of the same legal questions don't change depending on that technology because even the floating turbines still need to be connected to the lake bed. And so that lake bed will need to be leased. But that's an important technological challenge. There are unknowns associated with Great Lakes offshore wind. An example is how might we get the required large ships and vessels to build such turbines into the Great Lakes if they're not compatible with the St. Lawrence Seaway? That's an important question that was identified from this conference. That's a little bit above my pay grade, but of course important to identify. There's also a lot of momentum for Great Lakes offshore wind. Folks from the workshop resoundingly shared that they felt their time was well spent at the workshop and they wanted to keep the momentum moving forward, to keep collaborating, excuse me, on additional research projects to start answering the challenges that we identified in that workshop. And finally, there is a lot of opportunity associated with Great Lakes offshore wind. I talked about the renewable energy goals of states in the region and different federal, national level goals. And offshore wind is a large untapped resource that could help meet these decarbonization goals in the coming years. Another example for opportunity is workforce development. There's a company in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin that has a contract to build a ship that's used to install offshore wind projects on the oceans. And so those kinds of workforce and economic developments are available to potentially benefit the Great Lakes region as well. And so with that, I will end here. Thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out to me. My email is here, especially if you want to challenge my, excuse me, note on Canada and potentially collaborate and expand our scope beyond just the US and be thinking about Canada as well. And if we have a couple of minutes, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cora. That was great. And we do have one question. Please, to the participants who are attending, the attendees, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A and we will answer them live right now. We've got a good 10, 11 minutes here. So from Renee Morgan, for New York State, New York CERTA determined that projects in the Great Lakes would be feasible but not cost effective and would need more studies. Is there anything more to share for Lake Erie and Lake Ontario in terms of offshore wind opportunities in those waters for New York State?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for bringing up that report. So that was an agency at the state of New York recently looked into opportunities for diversifying their energy mix, including Great Lakes offshore wind as a potential example, and they identified that it's not something that state is going to target at this time. I think an important thing to consider is that New York is also on the Atlantic coast, so they kind of have the best of the best at this time. Potential wind resource for the US, which is the Atlantic seaboard, because the water's not that deep, so you can put fixed turbines in, which we already have the technology ready to deploy for that. At the same time, I do want to acknowledge that they sort of identified that the Great Lakes offshore wind is not a priority of theirs. I think another thing to consider is the difference in the wind speed of the lakes and the depth of the lakes. So the easternmost lakes are not as deep as Lake Superior over on, the far west side of the region, for example. Lake Superior has the highest wind speeds, but then we're also thinking about population center, right? Just because Lake Superior has the fastest wind speed, it's also the deepest, so it's hard to, you can't put a fixed turbine out in the middle of Lake Superior where the highest wind speeds are. And so it's an interesting report to come from New York, but it certainly hasn't stopped interest in other states. Illinois, I think, has recently, over the past couple sessions, been reintroducing exploratory sort of legislation for Great Lakes offshore wind near the coast of Chicago. And there are some other states that have been interested as well. And so I think part of the story, like I said, is sort of the unique situation of New York being also on the coast for offshore wind.
Wonderful. Thanks, Cora. Our next question is from Clive Tattersall. Given the challenges that you mentioned with wind turbines, how do you feel about wave energy to rival offshore wind costs by 2030s, study shows? So, and Clive linked an article put out by offshoreenergy.biz, and it's a business development and project that that we've shared in the chat, not just the Q&A. So, Cora, what are your thoughts on that?
That's interesting. I'm not as familiar with wave energy technology. I've sort of come across it in passing as we're looking at these leases for offshore wind development. There have been other non-wind specific leases that we just came across in passing that were for sort of experimental projects related to wave energy. So that could be a potential resource that, even though it's different than offshore wind, it may have some of those same legal questions, even though the technology is different, of if you're going to put a mechanism out in the lake to capture the waves, there's still going to need to be, electricity transmission lines, right, that get that energy from the middle of the lake to the shore and to where people use it. And so the same sort of legal questions arise. One other thing I want to note, just thinking of different sort of out on the lake resources, I've also come across in passing solar panels out on the lake as well, which is just sort of another interesting alternative. But I can't speak really to the technology of the wave energy options.
Well, wonderful. Well, that concludes our Q&A. Those are all the questions we've got. So we really appreciate your time and energy on this, Cora, and thank you to all of our participants who were able to come and participate and attend and listen to Cora. We greatly appreciate it. We sure did learn a lot. So thanks a lot, Cora.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. And I just put my email again in the chat too, if that's easier for folks to like copy paste. So please feel free to reach out.
Wonderful.
Thanks so much.
I sincerely hope this leads to collaborations. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks.